through your news feed and see those stories about couples splitting up, and you're like, what? Well, in the Philippines, get this, clashing personalities, you could actually use that as grounds for annulment. It happened in this Supreme Court case that has got everybody talking, Laroco v. Laroco. We've got the legal documents, and trust me, this is going to be a juicy deep dive.
Yeah, this case is really interesting. It kind of reshaped how people in the Philippines think about psychological incapacity. It moved away from needing a strict medical diagnosis and started looking more at how personalities actually work, like interact within a marriage.
Okay, so let's say you're in the Philippines and your marriage is falling apart. You can't just get a divorce like in a lot of other countries. Annulment is basically the only way to legally end things. That's a whole other thing, isn't it?
Totally. Annulment's like saying the marriage was never really a real marriage in the first place. Often, it's because of something that was already an issue before the wedding even happened, like hitting rewind, saying, nope, this marriage never should have happened.
Okay, so the heart of this case, we've got Dionisio Laroco. He's described as like very meticulous, a real order-driven kind of guy. And then there's Aurora Laroco, who's painted as much more free-spirited. They get married back in 1971, and let's just say it wasn't exactly smooth sailing from there.
There were red flags right from the start, actually. Like, before the marriage even happened, Dionisio broke things off because he suspected Aurora was seeing other men. And his family even, they labeled her as, like, promiscuous, dishonest, and flirtatious. You can kind of feel the tension already, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of family drama right there.
Yeah.
But then Aurora gets pregnant, and, well, they end up having a shotgun wedding. Not exactly the best start to a happy marriage, is it?
Definitely not the ideal start. And those early warnings, they really seem to have foreshadowed what their marriage would become. They have 3 kids, but the relationship was just full of accusations. Infidelity on Aurora's part, constant arguments, their personalities just clashed, and money troubles on top of everything else.
Okay, so we've got this marriage that sounds pretty messy, but when does it actually become, like, officially a case of psychological incapacity?
That's the big question, right? So years go by, and finally Dionisio files for an annulment. He's saying that both he and Aurora were psychologically incapable of making the marriage work, like from the very beginning.
So it's not just like they didn't get along. He's saying they were so fundamentally mismatched that the marriage was doomed from the get-go.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
The lower courts, they actually said, nope. They denied Dionysio's petition. Back then, they had a stricter interpretation of what psychological incapacity meant. They didn't think there was enough proof of a serious mental disorder to, like, justify an annulment.
So it's not just about saying we don't get along and poof, annulment. You needed like an actual diagnosis, like from a doctor.
Yeah, pretty much. Back then, it was all about proving that one spouse, or even both, had a mental illness that made it impossible for them to do what they were supposed to do in a marriage. Just showing they had personality clashes or couldn't communicate, not enough.
Okay, that makes sense, but it seems like a really high bar to clear for an annulment. This is where the Supreme Court steps in and maybe shakes things up a little.
You got it. The case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and their decision in Laroco v. Laroco, GR Num 253342, June 22, 2022, it totally changes the game. Basically, they redefined psychological incapacity for Philippine law.
And this is what gets me. They moved away from needing a specific medical diagnosis and started focusing more on this practical question. Can these two people, with their personalities, can they actually function as a married couple?
That's a great way to put it. The Supreme Court realized that sometimes it's not about mental illness. It's about, like, deep incompatibility that makes a real marriage impossible. And this decision, it set a big precedent for future annulment cases.
Let me make sure I'm getting this right. The Supreme Court saying that if the personality clashes are bad enough, they can be just as valid a reason for annulment as, like, a mental disorder.
That's exactly it. And they knew things could get a little subjective. So they set up specific criteria to figure out when this incompatibility and antagonism is actually serious enough to be considered psychological incapacity.
So what are those criteria? What are the courts looking at when they're deciding if a couple's differences are actually enough to, like, annul a marriage?
They focus on 3 big things: gravity, juridical antecedents, and incurability. And these become really important for how annulment cases are handled from this point on.
Well, then let's break down those legal terms a bit. I bet our listeners are wondering what on earth they mean. What's gravity in this context?
Good point. So gravity here means how serious are these personality differences really? Are they so deep and, all over the place that the couple just can't function as a married unit? It's not just disagreeing sometimes, it's like fundamental incompatibility that affects their whole relationship.
So it's not about little quirks we all have, but like major personality clashes that create constant conflict and make it impossible to build a life together.
Exactly. Imagine two puzzle pieces that just don't fit together, no matter how hard you try. And in this case, the Supreme Court felt that all the arguing, the inability to agree on even basic stuff, that showed this gravity.
Okay, so 1 point for Dionisio. What about that second one? Juridical antecedents. That sounds really complicated.
It's a big word, but it's really important. Juridical antecedents basically asks, were there signs of these personality problems even before they got married? Were there, like, red flags from the start?
So not problems that show up later, but things that were already there, those seeds of incompatibility right from the beginning.
Yep, that's
Yeah.
it. And this is where Dionisio's doubts about Aurora before the marriage and what his family thought of her behavior, it all becomes really relevant.
Interesting. So Dionisio not being sure about Aurora, his parents not approving, that could be seen as juridical antecedents.
Absolutely. That stuff about their personalities and how they might clash, it becomes really important in the Supreme Court's decision. It's a big lesson, for anyone thinking about marriage. Pay attention to those early signs.
Like that saying, hindsight is 20/20. But in this case, the court's saying, hey, sometimes you can actually see the problems coming before you say, I do.
Exactly. And that leads us to the last criterion, incurability. This one doesn't necessarily mean they couldn't try therapy or counseling. It's more about whether there's a real chance of actually getting past those really deep personality differences.
So not that it's literally incurable, but more about how likely it is that they'll ever really work through those incompatibilities,
Yeah.
even with professional help.
You got it. The court understood that some personality clashes are just so fundamental, it's unlikely they'll ever be truly fixed, even with everyone trying their best.
Okay, so how did all of these criteria play out in Laroco? Did the Supreme Court agree that Dionisio and Aurora's differences were grave? That they were there all along and basically incurable?
They did. Looking at the evidence and with their new interpretation of psychological incapacity, the Supreme Court decided in favor of Dionisio. He got the annulment he'd been fighting for.
Wow, so after all those years, he finally got it. That's a huge decision, isn't it?
It really is, and this is where the case gets even more interesting. The Supreme Court's ruling had a ripple effect, going way beyond just Dionisio and Aurora. It was like a shockwave through the Philippine legal system. It basically opened the door for other couples to try and get annulments based on personality clashes, even if there wasn't a clear mental illness diagnosis.
That's major. It's like they changed the rules of the game for ending a marriage in the Philippines.
Exactly. But, it's not a free pass. You still need to prove those three things: gravity, juridical antecedents, and incurability. But this case definitely made it possible for more things to be considered grounds for annulment.
Okay, we've covered a lot. We've looked at Laroco itself. We went through those criteria for psychological incapacity, and we even touched on how big of a deal this decision was. But what I find really fascinating is how this case, it feels like it reflects something bigger happening in society, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's not just a legal battle. It's a glimpse into how the Philippines, a country with strong Catholic traditions and no divorce, it's wrestling with the complexities of modern relationships. That's something we're going to delve into in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm already hooked. This is so much more than just like legal analysis. It's a look into how love, marriage, and the law, how they all come together in a world that's constantly changing. But before we move on, what about you listening? What are you thinking about this case so far? Does this idea of ending a marriage because of personality differences, does that sit right with you? Hit that favorite button if this deep dive is making you think about relationships in a new way, and leave a comment telling us what you think. We'd love to hear from you.
We'll be back with more on Laroco v. Laroco and what it means for marriage and relationships in the Philippines and beyond.
So before we really got into the legal details, you mentioned how this case kind of hit home for a lot of people because it's about this question.
Yeah, it makes you think, is love always enough? Can a marriage really work if the people in it, if their personalities just clash all the time?
And we were saying how this case, It becomes even more important when you think about the culture in the Philippines.
Exactly. It's a mainly Catholic country, and they have strong values about marriage. And here's the thing, divorce isn't even legal there.
So for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar, in the Philippines, if a couple wants to end their marriage legally, annulment is the only way.
That's right. And before this Laroco case, getting an annulment was way harder. Courts really focused on proving psychological incapacity in a very strict way, like they often needed an actual diagnosis of some serious mental illness.
So this case wasn't just about Dionisio and Aurora. It really changed things for so many other couples dealing with similar issues in the Philippines.
It was a huge shift. It's like Laroco said, hey, a successful marriage, it's not just about how long it lasts, it's about the quality of the relationship, if they can function as a couple and if both people are, well, happy.
That brings up this question of, like, where's the balance between individual happiness and the idea of marriage being sacred? Some people might say making annulment easier could weaken the commitment people make to their vows. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good point. People who disagree with the ruling, they worry that it could make marriage seem less important, that it'd be too easy for couples to just give up when things get rough. There's this fear that there'd be way more annulments, that people would look for a quick fix instead of trying to work through their issues.
So it's like, where do we draw the line? How do we protect the idea of marriage while also accepting that sometimes two people just aren't compatible, and that's a valid reason to end things?
Yeah, it's a tough balance, and there's no easy answer. The Laroco case didn't just throw the doors open for anyone to get an annulment easily. Remember those three criteria: gravity, juridical antecedents, and incurability? Those are still really important.
Right. It's not like you can just say, we bicker sometimes, so our personalities clash. Annulment, please. It's still a high bar, but it's different now. It recognizes that a marriage can have serious problems even without a medical diagnosis of mental illness.
That's it. The court still wants strong evidence that the incompatibility is a big deal, that it goes way back, and that it's unlikely to change.
That makes me wonder, has this ruling had a noticeable effect on how Filipino society views marriage and annulment?
It's still pretty recent, but yeah, the case definitely got people talking. Some people think it's a good thing that it acknowledges that incompatible personalities are a real issue and that it gives people who are trapped in unhappy marriages a way out.
That makes sense. It kind of fits with this modern view that people should be able to pursue happiness, even in a society that's traditionally conservative.
Right. More and more people are realizing that staying in a miserable marriage just to keep up appearances or because of societal pressure, it doesn't help anyone, especially if there are kids involved.
But then there's still this deep respect for tradition and religious values. What about the Catholic Church in the Philippines? How have they responded to this new legal interpretation?
Well, the church is still against divorce, and they have a stricter view of annulment. They emphasize how important it is to uphold the sacredness of marriage, and they encourage couples to try counseling and reconciliation if possible.
So it's this interesting situation. The law is changing to keep up with modern relationships, but religious institutions are holding on to more traditional views.
It's a reflection of this debate that's happening all over the world, How do we balance changing values and individual needs with long-held traditions? The Laroco case just brings it all into focus in this very specific context.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It's not just about the legal stuff. It's about real people, real relationships, and trying to find happiness and fulfillment.
It's about this constant back and forth between what individuals want and what society expects, between sticking to tradition and moving forward.
I'd love to hear from our listeners on this. What do you think? How has the Laroco decision affected Filipino society? Has it had a positive or negative impact on how people see marriage and annulment? Go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments.
And for those who want to dig a little deeper into the legal side of things, we'll be putting some key doctrines and legal terms related to this case in the show notes. Check those out to get a more in-depth understanding.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. It's amazing how one Supreme Court case can lead to so many questions about love, commitment, individual happiness, and what it even means to have a successful marriage.
It shows us that the law isn't set in stone. It changes over time to reflect how our understanding of relationships and societal values evolves.
And who knows what the future holds? Maybe someday divorce will be legal in the Philippines. Or maybe the focus will shift to making premarital counseling and support systems better so couples have a stronger base from the very beginning.
Those are some interesting ideas, and it'll be fascinating to see how things play out. But one thing's for sure, this conversation that Laroco v. Laroco started, it's not over. It's a conversation that people all over the world are having, and it makes us all think about our own beliefs about love, commitment, and finding happiness in a world where the very definition of marriage is changing.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been talking all about this really interesting case, Laroco v. Laroco, and how it's impacted things, legally and socially, in the Philippines.
Yeah, from changing how psychological incapacity is defined to starting this nationwide discussion about what marriage even means these days, this case has really gotten people thinking about love and commitment.
We've looked at the legal stuff, explored the cultural side of things, and even heard some different opinions from our listeners.
Yeah.
But before we finish up this deep dive, I want to go back to something you said earlier about how this case, it has implications that go way beyond the Philippines.
Right, right. It might seem like this very specific legal case in one particular culture,
Yeah.
but it really gets at something everyone deals with, that challenge of figuring out incompatibility in relationships.
And that's something pretty much anyone can relate to,
Yeah.
right? I mean, whether you're talking about romantic relationships, friendships, even families, we've all had those moments where personalities clash and it causes friction.
For sure. And the Laroco case makes us think about this question that can be kind of uncomfortable. What happens when those clashes, when they're so fundamental that it feels like the whole relationship is at risk?
It's like that saying, you can't fit a square peg in a round hole, you know? Sometimes, no matter how much love there is or how much people want it to work, their personalities just don't fit. And that can lead to a lot of hurt and frustration.
It happens to a lot of people, but nobody really wants to talk about it. We hear things like, work through your problems, compromise, don't give up on love. But what this Laroco case shows us is that sometimes, even though it's hard, realizing that you're incompatible can be a step towards finding something better.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It kind of goes against that pressure from society to stay in a relationship no matter what, even if it's doing more harm than good.
Exactly. It makes us ask ourselves, how much compromise is too much? When do differences become things you just can't get past? Is it ever okay to say, this isn't working, even if we've tried everything?
Those are really tough questions, and I don't think there's one answer that works for everyone. But I think Laroco encourages us to be honest with ourselves and with our partners about those big differences and to get help if we need it, whether that's therapy or counseling or just talking openly and honestly with each other.
I totally agree. And it reminds us that sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves and for the other person is to admit when a relationship is over, even if it goes against what society tells us.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. We started with what seemed like a very specific legal case in the Philippines, and it's turned into this exploration of love, compatibility, and how relationships are changing all over the world.
It's amazing how one story can bring up so many questions that everyone thinks about. It makes us challenge what we believe about commitment, happiness, and what it really means to build a good life, whether we're talking about romantic relationships or not.
And that's what makes the deep dive so great. We take these topics that might seem kind of niche, and we peel back the layers, find those unexpected connections, and hopefully give you some new insights that make you see things differently.
We hope this one gave you a lot to think about as you navigate your own relationships and everything else life throws at you.
And remember, the conversation doesn't have to stop here. Keep thinking about these things, share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to the deep dive so you don't miss out on our next adventure.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.